Hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Danielle Varda. I'm our CEO and founder at Visible Network Labs, and we are going to get started in just a minute, just kind of letting everyone jump into the Zoom room. So get comfy. We're going to talk network science for a little bit, especially focusing on our key players. Um, as folks are coming in, we would love it if you went into the chat and introduce yourself and tell us who you are, and why you're interested in networks. So maybe you are a network leader, you might be a researcher, or a foundation, all kinds of different types of folks that we know get connected with this kind of work. So please introduce yourself, let us know why you're here, and we would love to learn more about you. Okay. Oh, we have lots of folks jumping in. So we'll just keep admitting them, and I think I will get started. We're going to go ahead and record today. So if you're on, you'll see the little message that comes up that says we are recording. And all right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so I am Danielle Varda. I mentioned I'm the CEO and founder at Visible Network Labs, longtime network scientist studying communities and social connectedness and how it impacts our outcomes. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Jenny Lawler, who is going to tag team this presentation with me. And we have our support staff here, Alex Durr, who you probably get emails from and can communicate with throughout this and following after through his email contact, which hopefully you already have at any time. So again, we're hoping that you'll put your intro in the chat, let us know who you are and how you've landed here today, what your connection is and interest to network science and social network analysis and community. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to just jump right into it after this. We're going to talk about key players today. We do a lot of work here at Visible Network Labs with community organizations. And this is one of the most common requests that we get, which is how do we just sort through all of these nodes and lines and find the key people, the key organizations, those influencers or vulnerable spots and networks that can help us build strategies, action steps, and also a lot of learning. So the way we're going to present this today is I'm going to talk a little bit about what it looks like when you're identifying key players kind of visually, when we just are looking at maps and can kind of almost guess or spot where they are. But then Jenny is going to bring the really good stuff with looking at how we identify key players using data and how the actual science behind networks helps us find what we can't really find just intuitively or by looking at a picture. And of course, we'll have time for Q&A and some discussion at the end. I will tell you just a little bit about our organization. We're a very small group of about 10 people at Visible Network Labs. We talk about making invisible networks visible. So our mission is to strengthen social connectedness at the individual and systems levels for better outcomes, whether they be health, mental health, economic, or environmental outcomes. The partners that we are so privileged to work with are usually working on some kind of social impact in a space that ranges from public and community health to education to environmental strategies. And we know that we are embedded in all of these different networks, but we can't usually see them. So if we can use data and approaches that bring us really high quality insights, it can actually make a world of difference in how we're able to leverage the impact of those networks. So we do that. With this small team, we have half of us are developers and product people, and the other are data scientists. But we do offer primarily data and mapping tools, which we'll get to share with you all today, and a lot of learnings as training and workshops. So we decided to do this one today because we have had so many requests recently around what kinds of ways that we look at key players in these community organizational and interpersonal networks, and then also what kinds of technologies we have and features that can help you along with that. So The tool that you'll see that we use is called the Partner CPRM, and Partner is our platform. CPRM stands for a Community Partner Relationship Manager, and the CPRM is a play on a CRM. It was really our public health partners who said to us, could we use the partner platform to do the work that we do in CRMs? So CRMs are customer relationship management systems, usually meant to convert people to paying customers through marketing funnels. That is not really the partner and community user community that we interact with. Most of the folks who are interested in this kind of work are doing things like ecosystem building or stakeholder mapping, building community networks. And so the tools that help us market and funnel people through those cycles is not really the same tools that we need. However, a lot of the features are the same. So we really do need a place to put all the members of our ecosystems, understand all their characteristics, and then what's kind of special is being able to connect the dots and see how they are emerging with partnerships and things like that. So you'll get to see the CPRM a couple of times here as we demonstrate some of these ways that we use it. But this is a tool that I'm really proud of. At Visible Network Labs, we believe in community engagement and community input, and also the democratization of data. So we believe if we take data from community, we should find ways to give it back. So within our CPRM, you'll find some really distinct ways of a workflow that allows people to share data back with people who we collect it from. So unlike a CRM, which is usually used internally in an organization and not shared, a lot of the users of the CPRM are intentionally sharing data outside of their organization to build capacity in an entire network of partners. And so you'll see features that do that, and then just our approach to the work is built around that. So very proud of our team that uses these values to build technology in ways that are meant to empower and nurture social connectedness in communities. All right, so we're going to jump right into what we mean by key players and centrality in networks. So you're going to see we're going to go through some project examples here. So we'll just start with kind of a basic. And so this is, if you are kind of an old school SNA person like me, you might recognize this kite network. So David Crackhart, one of our kind of longest, most legacy teachers in social network analysis, presented this to me in a workshop many years ago as a way to demonstrate the concepts of centrality in networks. So we're not really going through the whole background of networks, but I will say that we use this word networks to describe the process of collaboration or collective impact or whatever it is, because we look at these as nodes and lines. And the nodes are usually, in this case, you'll see names of people. We do a lot of work in interorganizational network analysis. So that means these nodes are labeled as organizations often. And then the lines between them represent those relationships. The third type of data in a network are the attributes, the ways that we can characterize each of these nodes. So we're not going to go too far into the background of that, kind of assuming that a lot of folks here might understand that, but we will show you how to implement that in a moment. But this concept is really showing us one of the great values of social network analysis in the most simple kind of structure that we could see. So I always remembered Dr. Crackhart would talk about how these were the fewest number of nodes to show these three concepts of centrality. And what it does end up looking like is a kite. So these three types of centrality are degree, closeness, and betweenness centrality. So I use this as a teaching tool a lot. I've been a professor for many years, and I'll often ask my class, who in this network looks to be the most central? And what we'll see is most people will raise their hand and say, it's Diane, because clearly she's at the center and she has the most number of connections. And you'll see this is kind of a fuzzy map because it's a very old screenshot. That the degree centrality here listed has Diane the highest. So degree centrality is really a key player position that tells us who has the most number of connections. So that's kind of an obvious way to see the network here with seeing Diane. But another really key position, which also might be pretty obvious to you, is Heather. So Heather, you'll see over here, has the highest what we call betweenness centrality. So betweenness centrality is really that kind of position that if we were to remove the node from the network, it would break the network apart. So let's say here that this is our community coalition working day to day. And then Ike and Jane may be funders or politicians that we're really interested in. And Heather is our connection to them. So if we lose Heather from the network, it's a very vulnerable position, a very key position that she holds, because we could fragment the network and no longer have connections. So we might want to build strategies where we build extra connections to Ike and Jane, or we just determine that that would be okay and we'll start all over when we get there. The third type of centrality shown here is closeness centrality. And you'll see that over here, Fernando and Garth hold the highest measures of closeness centrality. So what makes them special is that if you looked at where they're positioned and everyone they're connected to, and added all of that up, they actually have the shortest paths between themselves and everyone else in the network. So what that means is if we were to give, say, Fernando and Garth some information, some gossip, and told them to give it to everyone they're connected to, who then did exactly the same thing, it would most quickly spread through the network and diffuse. So this is really an interesting position when we are thinking about not just the spread of news, but also things like the spread of disease. So it's not Diane or someone like Heather who may be our key players in those kinds of use cases, but Fernando and Garth, who we might want to identify as those that can most quickly diffuse information or other things throughout a network. So we just wanted to start with like the basics of key players and centrality. One of the big questions in these kinds of looks at networks is, where does the data come from? How do we actually learn this? So we'll go through that in just a moment. Just before we look at a network, we wanted to just go through some of what are like the classic ways that people use key player analysis in networks. So you might recall some of these. And again, I'm just an old school network analyst, so some of them come from when I was just learning. But this one over here on the left, and I couldn't find a clearer photo or image here, was Valdez Krebs' work after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where he was looking at who key players were in that event. And you'll see here the nodes are colored by different planes that this group of terrorists were on. These were the pilots, or the terrorists who were on different planes. And what he was really looking at, he did this through some secondary data collection of reports of who was where, was really looking for where are folks in these chains that are actually in those betweenness centrality kind of positions. So in a terrorist network, what we're often interested in is how to fragment the network, how to tear it apart. And often the person or the entity with the most number of connections is the least interesting to us because they're very visible. What we're looking for in covert networks, things like this, are those kinds of key players that are not very visible, because then if we can find those folks, we might be able to remove them from networks and then kind of tear the network apart. Now, that's a really unusual strategy. It's not common that we're trying to undo networks. We're usually trying to leverage and bring them together. On the right, you'll see here a pretty classic study about happiness from Fowler and Christakis. And this study was really looking at the kind of diffusion, or what we refer to as homophily in networks. So who are those people that we're connected to and what are their behaviors? And what we've learned through multiple types of studies and a larger study called the Ad Health longitudinal study is that we tend to pick up behaviors of people who are close to us, which then become pretty key as players in our network. So in this particular study, they learned that people who are happy tend to be connected to other happy people. We have similarly learned that people who may be obese might be connected to other obese people. People who smoke are connected to other smokers. So the concept of homophily, that birds of a feather flock together, is really a really natural way that we form networks. But we are interested in that because if we want to influence behavior, we might want to find those folks that are connected to people in certain ways so that we can introduce interventions that allow diffusion to spread. Okay, two more quick ones, and then we'll um, get into a couple other things. But these have been pretty more recent. So we started to see a lot of network maps in the news around COVID. And there was a lot of questions. One that was there's three pretty big questions I found in just my research on this. One was, where did it come from and how did it spread across continents? So the second one was, how did influencers who are things like celebrities or government officials spread news that either, took things in one direction or another? And in this case, this is a study by Block et al. In Nature that basically was looking at the impact of social distancing. So how would this disease spread if we implemented social distancing and if we did not? This was a classic key player study because how folks were connected to each other, obviously those with high degree centrality would be at most risk of spreading. So again, we kind of want to diffuse to disintegrate lots of degree centrality, lots of connections inside these COVID networks and get these kind of chains going instead that had fewer connections. So that was a pretty interesting way that folks started to look at that kind of data. And then something that this map is not very telling, but one of the ways that we see corporations or kind of people inside social media today really looking at key player analysis is really through marketing strategies and influencers. So we see a lot of content creators, the whole world of how someone gets followers and how they influence those around them is a great use case of a social network analysis approach where we might be interested in these kinds of things. Okay, so just a couple of use cases. So what I'm going to do now is actually, though, bring it back to an example that we've done and show you how we can kind of spot key players in maps. But I'm not going to describe the science behind it yet. That's something that Jenny's going to do for us. What I am about to show you is an example of a network that we have inside the Partner CPRM. It's referred to as the Jeffco CPRM. I live in Jefferson County, Colorado, so this one's very close to home. But this is an example of a county-wide community partnership database. There's a link down here. It's just our website /Jeffco-CPRM if you're interested. There's a whole landing page there. One of the most interesting things about the Jeffco CPRM is that it was designed intentionally by and funded by a community foundation, the Colorado Gives Foundation here in Colorado, as with intention to be a public-facing, completely free partnership database for the county. The focus was on organizations that work together to serve people in Jefferson County around different areas like workforce development, early childhood, food systems, and older adults, for example. And so what we were approached by the foundation to build a version of this kind of database that could have access to people. When people put data in it, they knew they were building a tool together with us. And so we're really excited about this because it's the first and only that we know of a completely public-facing CPRM, which is why I'll be able to show it to you in just a moment here, so that we can ground ourselves in what we are looking at. There's a list of what we did here, so I'll just kind of through a narrative explain it. The foundation came to us and said, can we build this? We worked very closely with community leaders in these different areas to create a list of organizations that serve the people in Jefferson County. We developed a membership list of those folks with lots of attributes, lots of characteristics about them, including who they serve, ages they serve, where they serve, and what they do. We developed a set of questions to help us get more information from them, and then invited about 100 organizations to participate and put their data in. We did receive 69 organizations in 2 phases of information. And what's really been fun about this is all the giving back of the data. So we were able to create reports and dashboards. So if you go to that link, that's where you can access all of this and really engage community members by building their capacity to use it. So if a community member has a question about a key player, they can go in and look it up themselves. So that's a really fun thing. Often network studies are so kind of removed from the actual people who we take the data from. So this is we love this example because we're able to give it right back. it's not easy for people to see and navigate network data. So we also have realized we kind of have to build that capacity inside communities. So I am actually going to switch over to that to do just a little example of how key players might be found in a real data set. So what you're looking at here is the Partner CPRM and the database that I just introduced, which means that everything in here is completely public facing. So I can show you everything from names of organizations to the relationships between them. So what you're looking at is the Jeffco CPRM, and we refer to this as its ecosystem. This one has 186 nodes in it and about 1,200 relationships. So that's telling us, if I click on any one of these, I can see who that member is, and I might be interested in some of their information. Down here, you'll see some of their centrality scores. In degree is how many partners picked them, and out degree is how many they picked. You'll hear a lot of network analysts talk about the most interesting and maybe valid centrality score as being in degree. So I, as Head Start of Lakewood, could pick 33 partners, but in return, 10
Hello,
picked.
Louise speaking.
So when we have that kind of validation of those kinds of ties coming in and out, it tells us a lot about the position of those actors. So in a survey, if I picked 33, it would make me very central in this network. But if we look at in degree, it's kind of tells you who others perceived as most central in the network. So this is just a little example. What you're going to see here is that the nodes, they're colored by an attribute called primary sector. So you'll see the list over here. And admittedly, this is kind of a big jumble. So one thing we wanted to show you is how you can kind of intuitively look at networks and maps and make sense of them. We're going to do that in two different ways. But one thing I always say is this is a lot to take in, and most people cannot make sense of it. I mean, the way that the algorithm works for how these network maps are drawn is called a spring algorithm. So usually those with more ties, really high degree centrality, get moved to the middle. So if I were to hover on one of these, you'll start to see how many ties are coming in and out of them versus these on the periphery here who have far fewer. So those with fewer connections get pushed out, and those with a lot of connections get pulled to the middle. Still, this doesn't tell us very much. So what I like to do is, well, there's two things we can do. We can size by different kinds of centrality in maps, and then we kind of start to see this, and not surprisingly, the bigger nodes with the higher centrality are here in the center. I'm going to go ahead and take that off for a second just to make this easier to look at. But I think what is helpful in networks is to start with a blank slate. So this is where I like to start. And so I'm just going to run through a quick use case of how we might find important or key players in a network like this. So I'm going to pick our public health partners and our school partners. I already mentioned COVID. Really interesting thing in communities is the relationship between schools and public health, which actually was strengthened in most cases during COVID because of the interaction between health departments and schools during school closures, for example. So here we see the kind of post-COVID relationships in Jefferson County. An interesting thing you'll see here and across Jefferson County is that while we brag a lot about collaboration, we see them in these very sectored silos. And that tells us immediately that we could do better. We could actually start to create new relationships almost immediately by looking at where we have a lot of gaps. So by just looking at this, we can start to see some kind of interesting things. So for example, we have 74 down here, which is a school labeled as a school organization, but not connected to the school other school nodes as well. So I can click on it and say, okay, this is our home instruction for parents of preschool youngsters, if you know the HIPPY program. So we can see them here, and they have some pretty strong, some good relationships here to the health department, but not over here to the other school communities. But if I look at an organization like 111, I'll see that they have very high out degree centrality. This is Jeffco Public Schools Family and Community Engagement. I might highlight them just to keep an eye on them here in this map. But so they have a high degree centrality. You'll see it was an out degree centrality. But then what might be more interesting, and this would be more of a bridging position, is a node like this one or 104 that are actually starting to connect the dots across diverse kinds of organizations. So I might look here at 155. I see this is Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, who is our state health department. If I click on that little eyeball, it's going to tell me even more about them. But this is helping us see a couple of key players that we might be interested in just by looking at the map. So just a couple of other things we might want to think about here. So we might think, how do we actually contact 155 and say, tell us about some of your relationships with the schools. How can we actually improve our own relationships with them as well? So use them as kind of a best practice. I can also look at different types of relationships. So I might be mostly interested, for example, this is data that describes the kinds of activities between these folks. So what I'm looking at is just their position, and I don't really know anything about their relationship. This doesn't say much yet. But if I clear this and then I say, let me just look at the client referrals, well, now I see this kind of different map. I don't even see all of the same organizations that were in there before. And right here, 104 has now become very central where they were not before. So this is our Jeffco Public Health WIC program. I'm going to go ahead and highlight them. So for client referrals, we're seeing the Jeffco schools referring into them, but also a lot of these public health organizations as well. And so here we can start to begin to see kind of nuances of key players based on the quality or the content of their relationship. So that makes the concept of a key player more valuable to us, because now we not only see how they're connected, but what they're doing in those connections. I'll just show you one last thing that could be interesting. So I've just been looking at public health and schools, but I might be interested in how our food security, food access organizations are interacting within this network. So if I bring them in, I see a lot of new connections. And again, I'm just looking at client referrals here. But here I see 111 is actually very well connected to these food systems organizations. So 111 has a pretty interesting position in here. They're the family and community engagement team at Jeffco Schools in ways that they're connecting maybe that could be leveraged to build and build our bench for being able to create new client referrals between not just schools and public health, but also between other things like food systems. And why is this important? Well, we may have an assumption that kids learn better when they are healthy and they have food and things like that. So we could also be interested in bringing in our housing organizations. So if we are working on a strategy for how we actually help kids succeed based on things like their social determinants of health or social determinants of education, we may really be interested in a network like this, and who are our key players who can help us. Let me redo this, who can help us begin to see where all those connections are, so we could provide like a whole person kind of strategy. So we can continue to see differences in these key players based on different kinds of characteristics about them, or different kinds of sharing, for example, sharing data, different kinds of work that they're doing. And so where you see key players in one type of context, for example, sharing data, we start to see even another different situation here where 113 just became interesting to us because they're bridging now two sectors. So I just wanted to kind of show you a real life example, how you might explore in a network, especially if you have a database like this. But what I'm going to do is pass it off to Jenny now, who's actually going to explain a little bit more of the science behind this and how this might work from less of a gut intuition and who I think looks like they are key players, and more of an actual scientific kind of approach. So Jenny, I am going to stop sharing. and pass it to you. Are you ready?
Thank you, Danielle.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see lots of both familiar names and organizations in here and also some that I have not encountered yet. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jenny Lawler. I'm our Director of Data Science and Insights here at VNL. And I think most people would say that I am like our big data cheerleader. I love talking about data, thinking about it. But I'm also a community psychologist, and I think we want to be as practical as possible and bring this data into a space of action and insight and trying to really match it up with the work that we're trying to do in the real world. So I'm actually going to kind of step backwards a little bit from what Danielle was saying and bring us to just a really basic example of the kind of data that we often have when we're doing this work in communities and how network data and especially data about positionality among the members of the network can be really important for making decisions and thinking about how we want to move forward. Let me get my slides moving here. So often, what we have when we're doing this work in communities is actually just, rows and columns, right, of data. We know some things about the people who might be involved in the work that we're doing. And oftentimes things come up. And the example that I want to pose here is, think about if you were trying to get information out to everybody in this community about a new practice, right? There's something that might be really exciting that everybody could be interested in that might improve the work that they're all doing. Think about, who would you contact first to help you get this information out? We can see here, right, the things that we know about them, right, is we know how excited they are about new practices and we know how friendly they are. So I know from my perspective, I would want to optimize those two things, like who is the highest in both of them, right? And that brings us to organization D, right? That's probably where I would first start if I was trying to get the word out about something new. But maybe we have one more piece of information, and that is just the number of contacts that organization has. So how many other organizations are they connected to? And now you might think about, does that change your answer? Would you maybe go to somebody else? And I know for me, looking at this, I start thinking, oh, B is really compelling, right? They have more connections than everybody, and they're still pretty excited about new practices and still pretty friendly. So that's kind of a compelling option. But we could also add one more dimension to this, and that's actually understanding the structure of those relationships. How are they actually set up in the network? And this looks, you're going to see kind of similar to that kite network that Danielle shared, where, if you recall, the ones that we were looking at were B and D, right? That we saw a couple that had lots of connections and also those that were high on that friendliness and excitement. But what's interesting here, right, is this node A, they might not have as many connections, but they really are the critical kind of broker between these two parts of our network, right? And we wouldn't know that unless we actually had the structural data about how all of our relationships are connected to each other and what kind of the big picture is here. And that's why I think it's so critical to think about, how do we go from those kind of columns and rows of data into understanding our data from a more structural perspective. And that's really where network science can shine for us. And in fact, all of these different positions, as Danielle mentioned, there's tons of math that we can do to actually find them, identify them. Each node in this network can have a score that reflects its position and helps us to understand just how well connected they are to their partners. And we focus on 3 of those at Visible Network Labs. These are kind of the most common types of centrality. And here we have terms that we like to use for them. We use the term influencer, broker, and information exchanger. But in network science terms, people will refer to that as degree of centrality, betweenness centrality, and closeness centrality. And those are our kind of 3 main types of key players. But in the larger world of network science, I saw a few years ago, somebody did a systematic review and there were 70 that they just kind of pulled out of the literature in terms of different ways people think about who might be key in a network. So, rest assured that if you're thinking maybe I want to find someone through a really specific way, somebody who has a really special position. There are many ways to measure who's key in a network, but the 3 that we focus on, I would say, are the most common in the world of network science, and they're all fairly kind of constrained in terms of what they're used for and how we measure them. The first one is, as Danielle mentioned, that degree centrality. metric, we refer to those that have high degree centrality as our network influencers. And that's because our high degree centrality members have a lot of direct connections to other members of the network. So you can think of that similarly to like if you went to Instagram or whatever social media site you like, the people who we would talk about as influencers are the ones that have a lot of followers, right? They're very well connected. And we split this one up into two kind of camps. One is those that have a lot of relationships going out, right? So they have lots of partners that they've identified, but there's also those that have partners coming in, right? The followers that reflect back to them. And those two different directional approaches actually can be really valuable in different ways. And we'll have a chance to see that when we actually go back to the platform in a minute. Depending on what you're trying to measure, sometimes it is really important to see those that are going out, and sometimes it's important to see those going in. But these can be really helpful when you're trying to do work because, they might be a really important source of like getting information out, reaching lots of people all at once. It also might tell you who it's possible to influence in your network, right? If there are folks that have connections to somebody, then there's that opportunity for resources and influence to flow to them. But you can imagine like in the work that all of us do, right? Like 211 is like a huge source of information, right? Everybody has that direct connection to them. Often in communities, lots of providers refer in, and they have the ability to connect a lot of people out because they know who all those contacts are in the community. So that's one example that you might kind of hold in your head as we think about this. But then we have our network brokers, and that is just like in our example that we just looked at, right? Where we saw that node right in the middle. They're really important, but they're not necessarily the most connected. These are the ones that they have high betweenness centrality, and that's exactly what it sounds like. They sit in between others in the network. And mathematically, the way this is measured is actually how often a node falls on the shortest path between others in the network. So if you imagine in your network, any pair of two members have some pathway to get connected to each other, right? And it might be, through multiple layers of, oh, I know so-and-so and they know so-and-so who knows the person I'm trying to get to. And so we look at just how often does each node in the network fall on that pathway between all the other nodes. And if you fall on that pathway frequently, then that means that they are more likely to be a broker. They get a higher score. And so that's how we would identify that key player. And this can be, again, it's really useful for kind of figuring out who are those kind of key connectors. Like they might not be necessarily they might not be connected to everyone directly the way that an influencer is, but they could be in a really key position to help us reach, for example, subgroups that are otherwise disconnected, that sort of thing. And one thing I would highlight, especially about this one, is the importance of understanding the larger context of your network. So we might identify that somebody is in that key brokerage position, right? They might be the node that is connecting us to an otherwise disconnected subgroup that we really care about. We really want to be able to get information out to them. But that node, they might on one hand serve as a facilitator and they might help move that information along, but they also might be a gatekeeper, right? They might actually be the one who decides we're not going to move that information. And that's where, having multiple data points and looking beyond, the structural metrics to have other kind of key questions, key sources of information can be really helpful when you're looking at your key players. So it's not just, oh, we're going to calculate these structural numbers, we're going to find out who that person is, and then that's going to solve all our problems. There's really kind of a larger picture that we want to keep in mind when we're doing this work. And then finally, we have our information exchangers. And those are our nodes that have a high closeness centrality. And closeness centrality is sort of like if you imagine playing the game telephone as a kid, right? You remember how like you'd start with one person and you try to get your message all the way to the end. And the more kind of steps that it had to go through, the more people, like the worse it would be when you get to the end, right? The more diluted your message would be. So our information exchangers, they only have a couple of steps in between them and everybody else in the network. So they have fewer steps to go through to reach anybody else. And that's why we think of them as being really helpful for getting information out. And this is sort of, if anyone's ever heard of like the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? Kevin Bacon is really high on closeness centrality in the Hollywood Actors Network. There are very few actors that are more than just a couple steps away from Kevin Bacon. And there are some other really cool kind of network science reasons why that happens that we could talk about another time. But this is where, closeness centrality can be really helpful when you're like thinking about, okay, we want to get messages out. Who can help us to really do that effectively and help spread the word kind of organically through our network? And as I mentioned, knowing who falls into these key positions, who has high scores on these different types of centrality, it's great, it's helpful, but it's often insufficient. We want to have, other data points can really help us to build the story and understand our key players. And you already saw a little bit of that with the way that Danielle did some filtering and color coding in her the network that she showed. So that's a key way that we do this work. But also, we want to incorporate other data points. So we use things like information about how much different nodes in our network are trusted by other members, how much do other members of the network see value in the work that they do. And I'll talk about this in terms of some of the standard type survey questions that we use in our partner tool. But a lot of these are things that we see coming up across this type of work in community settings in general. So, first kind of thinking about just other survey questions we might ask or other data points we might integrate. When we're trying to identify key players, we often want to figure out, within a certain subnetwork. So contextualizing this within the relationships that exist. We know that just because a relationship exists between two nodes doesn't mean that they do all the activities that we might have in mind. So just like Danielle showed, really narrowing in, looking at our referral network or looking at everybody who is a member of an action team is really important as a way to kind of constrain where are those key players located and what are we trying to do. I also often will see groups look at key players first by filtering for the intensity of relationships. So looking at just those members of a network that are more deeply connected. So if they, sometimes members will say, oh yeah, we're kind of aware of each other, we're on each other's email list. And that might be that's a good thing to know. It helps you understand your network. But if you're trying to like mobilize members, that might not be quite enough. So you might filter out those kind of base level awareness level members in order to see what's going on among those that maybe have stronger or longer standing connections. But also, we can continue to think about how we add kind of other layers of data after we identify our key players by doing things like trying to characterize, who falls into that category of being a key player, meaning that they're really high on one of these types of centrality. And so sometimes, we might look at this, and one thing that I often will see across the board is that funders rise to the top, right? Lots of folks are connected to funders. We might see that. So that can be an interesting way, figuring out what are the characteristics of those that are key players can also help us to strategize and ask questions about how do we get those who maybe have historically not been included in our network to be more connected. And that it really starts with like making that topography of the network visible by mapping this and tracking those metrics. But also we can look at questions like what types of resources or assets different players bring to the network. So those who maybe are not key players, who are maybe low on some of these metrics, might bring things that are really valuable and important and have assets that are otherwise not well connected in the network. And we might want to ask our question about, how could our key players help us to get connected to those folks? Or how could we increase the connectivity of folks who might otherwise not be so well connected, but who bring a lot of value and have valuable insights to bring to the shared work that we do. And we'll have a chance to like look at all this in the platform in just a minute. But the other thing that is really helpful is, at least on our end, something that we always ask and include in our surveys is these two scales, one focused on value and one focused on trust. And these are actually relational scales. So members, when they identify who they have partnerships with, they actually rate those partners on these different dimensions of trust and value. And then we aggregate those up to create a score. So every member of the network has a score that shows on average how much other members of the network see them as valuable contributors to the network and also as trustworthy members of the network. So that can be really helpful when we're looking at key players to be able to say, okay, wow, so yes, this organization is well connected, but actually they might not be the most trustworthy member. And maybe we want to focus on somebody that is a little bit higher on trust, or there's somebody who, everybody says they're really a valuable contributor, but they are just not yet super well connected. How can we integrate them in different ways? And I'll show you a little bit about how we like to do that. But to really put all this together, we have kind of a full toolbox in Partner that covers lots of different ways that you might want to think about key players. And that includes first just a summary table that will tell you in ranked order which of your network members are, from highest to lowest on each of these key types of centrality. You can see that list and it'll show you which ones were high across multiple of these dimensions. So that's a really cool resource to use. But we also have our insights library in there, which has data and background to contextualize what we're doing with key players. So if you want to read the research and learn a little bit more about this and just stay grounded in it, that's the best place to visit. And we also, as Danielle kind of showed, have a tool that sizes by our key players in our network maps. So that takes all that background data and those hard metrics and makes it possible to visualize that in our networks. And likewise, we have our network scores table, which actually shows centrality scores in ways that you can then sort and search and really explore in tandem with other information about the nodes in our network. So I will bring us over to the platform again, just to show what some of this looks like in practice. There we go. And I'm going to show us actually a really simple version of this. So Danielle showed a really cool network map from our Jeffco project. This is actually one of our toy networks that we like to use for just exploring and demonstrating. And it's meant to sort of simulate a public health, community health network, the kind that we often see in the community spaces where we all might be working. So what we have here, this is all of our nodes and their relationships and the network as a whole. But as I mentioned, it's important to include other questions and other data points to really be able to understand what we're seeing. So first, I'm going to color code by our primary organization function. So now we have just a little more information about who's at the table here. We can kind of visualize that. And then, something that often comes up, as we saw with Danielle's network, was people like to look at client referrals. That's a really key network that often comes up in this type of work. And we can already kind of start to see, as you can imagine, that there's one pretty central actor in here. But using our size by tools, we can put the math behind it, and we can actually look at this in terms of centrality. So it's not surprising our public health node here is really high. And this is just overall centrality. So that's whether they have relationships going in or out. But I think it's really helpful when we look at this in terms of out degree, right? The public health one is just eclipses everybody else, right? They are making lots of referrals. So they might be sort of akin to like what we see with 211 in other communities. And in some ways, we might look to them and think, okay, that might be an interesting place. Like if their referrals are really successful, maybe they can help others to understand how to do this really well and how to manage a high volume of referrals. But when we size this by in-degree centrality, right, we see that everybody else gets a lot bigger. That the health department they're not bringing that data in so much as they are bringing it out to others. So if we want to think about how are the outcomes of those referrals working out, who is really successful in connecting people who need things to the resources they need, then we might look to some of these other organizations in this network. But we can also add, just really look at this in terms of the data. And that's where we can get into our summary table for key players. And so here in our platform, the way that you would do that is we have this little insights tab right here, and we have a key player button in there. And that brings up a table of all the members of this network, or at least it goes up to 10. So it shows us the top 10 members, and they're in order in each of these columns based on which one has the highest scores for each of these types of centrality. And you can see a little summary for what each of those are referring to here. But we can also turn it off and change this over to the actual name of the organization. So you can see here, who are our main information exchangers, brokers, and then those network influencers going both inward and outward. Oh, and then I must have refreshed that. But so that can be a really helpful tool to actually see, based on the data, who is at the top and who is maybe a little bit less connected in your network. And likewise, you can see we actually color them across these. So ones that show up multiple times that are kind of at the top of each of these will have a consistent color scheme. So you can actually track which ones are high across multiple. And it's not uncommon, especially in more densely connected networks, to see the same organizations are high across multiple settings. So that is just one way that you can kind of start bringing in that data. Something else that I always recommend is beyond just looking at like the summary table, putting these onto an actual geographic map. And actually looking at how centrality and key players are distributed across the communities that we work in. So you can see here, right, that we have lots of key player, we have a lot of, first, our nodes are concentrated around one area, and then there are others that are maybe a little bit dispersed. But then sizing by centrality and kind of sizing through different types of centrality help us to see, are the majority of our connections actually concentrated within one area? And often what we see is like urban areas there's more organizations there, those organizations are more connected. Sometimes that means that it's easier for them to get the work done and to move it ahead. So that can be an important kind of equity question when you're evaluating your network, is being able to see how the nodes and their relationships are actually distributed geographically. And then the other really cool thing that I want to just show us in terms of how we look at our data is actually putting this into a table and looking at it, numerically for each of our nodes in our network. So here we have a table that's built into the platform. It can show two views. The first one is just everybody in the network. The second one is just who's visible in the map at the moment. So always helpful to think about, if we're filtering down and we care about one specific thing, do we want to look just at that, or do we want to see kind of the picture of the whole network? But what I always recommend is actually sorting by centrality, whichever one we might be interested in. So that gives us kind of that view. Okay, here's who might be at the top, and then we can contextualize that in terms of other data points we have about them. So in this case, we see some alignment here. Our most central member of this network, the public health organization, also highly regarded by other network members. So they, in terms of the value that they bring, they're right at the very top, right? The scale has 4 as the maximum value, and that's where they are. And we can also see, they're also fairly well trusted in this network, right? They're pretty close to the top on that. We see there's maybe a couple that are also higher than them. But tools like this can really help us to understand and come to those insights about who could be helpful to advance the work that we're doing, and even especially starting to see like who might be those organizations that are not yet very well tapped, that might be in a good position to serve as a leader, that might really be able to help advance specific goals of the work that we're doing. So I'll just really briefly, I want to give us time for questions. I want to just bring us back to the slides one more time, and kind of highlight a couple just final points about this. And one is really, oh, here we go. How we think about, when we talk about identifying key players, I want to zoom us out a little bit and suggest, and I saw some questions in the chat about this, that really our key players have to do with the quality of the design that we put into, identifying our network and collecting our network data. And so that's where, I would say it really requires a lot of that intentionality on the front end to be able to find them in your work really effectively. And what I mean by that is like knowing, why do we want to find key players? What are the goals we're trying to achieve with this? And then setting up our process to really match that. So making sure that we bound our network in a way that we include everybody who's going to be relevant in the map, that we're asking the questions that help us to understand the types of relationships we care about the most. It's always super important to track your response rate. If you don't hear from people, you don't know what relationships might exist that you didn't hear about. So that can really affect, especially thinking about like degree centrality. Like if they don't respond to the survey, you don't have any out degree information about that particular organization or person or whatever. And same thing, those choices we make about how we filter and constrain our network can be really important for making sure that we get data that's useful to us. I always recommend that you all try it out for yourselves. Don't just take our word on, this process and how to do it. I think it's always helpful to try to find those insights on your own and play around with these networks. So you're all welcome, if you don't already have one, to set up a free account on the Partner platform. And we have in there a couple of kind of demo ecosystems that you can play around in and take a look at this data. The one that I think is kind of fun is called Snow White and Her Support Network. It's hopefully something that's relatable for everybody because it includes a character that you may be familiar with. But yeah, feel free to kind of jump in and take a look at it yourself. Um, and then I'll pause now and just see if there are any questions or comments at this stage of the game.
Right. Thank you so much. I was curious about for the relationships, especially the in degree and out degree, if one organization was mapping this for themselves without doing like a survey of other partners, how does that work? Because you really won't understand. Like if we were to map as we're a Jewish Family Services in Kansas City, if we were to map our own network and try to understand our key players, am I correct in saying we're not going to get that in degree information?
Yeah, that's a great question. And excited to have somebody from Kansas City here. Thank you for joining us. I used to live in Lawrence. So what you're actually talking about, that's a specific type of network in the world of network science. It's actually, we call it the ego network when you map your own organization's network. And so there are, certainly some metrics that you can get from that. And like you said, that the out degree is kind of the strongest measure that you would have for your own network. And sometimes it's possible through like other data sources to kind of find that out, about others if you don't want to survey them. I know we've done work in the past where we have like scraped websites and looked at, who do different organizations actually name as their partners, as one way to kind of capture that as an alternative. I think, nothing really replaces hearing it directly from the source about who they're working with, because often there are things that are just not visible to us and that might not be totally public. But yeah, certainly there are some other ways to like kind of learn about that and through either observation or finding other sources of data if you're not able to do a survey.
I'll
Thank you.
just add also in the we have a lot of folks who use the Partner CPRM for their workflow is just tracking their own organization's relationships with community partners. And so we didn't do all of this. We can do demos another time, but in the like list of members, you can, if you are logged in as a user, you can pick that member and then track your relationships with them. And it can change over time. So that also allows you to map like who from your organization is working with whom. You can kind of it's manipulating a little bit, but track like who's connected to whom. But then you start to have two ways of seeing the data. One is like people who reported the relationship, and then your perception of who's connected to whom. So you'd have to have a way to distinguish that. So when you look at a network, you know that these are perceptions of relationships and these are self-reported relationships as well. Also, someone else asked about kind of secondary data. You can import data into a lot of different kinds of network analysis tools, including this one, which would be like setting it up, either data you got through a survey or data that you collected that is representative of a network, usually in some kind of edge list. So if you have a way to kind of track who's connected to whom and you want to put that in there as data, that's also an option. You just have to set up all the fields ahead of time. Okay, I think we have time for a couple of other questions. We've had a lot of questions in the chat, so if you haven't had a chance to look, go ahead through those. Okay, so I'll answer a couple here. Alex will send out a recording, a link to the presentation after, I'm sure. And Jenny just answered, but we do have a lot of partners in Canada. So we've worked with health systems, education, early childhood groups. One of our longtime partners was a woman named Blythe Butler, who ran the first 2000 Days Network for many years, and came to join us at lots of workshops like this. So yeah, we have a lot of partnerships with folks up in Canada as well. All right. We are just getting to time. Any last questions? Jenny has her email up here, and she is a great resource. You can also click on this QR code and get our newsletter. But kind of our last action step we would invite you to do is go right onto the platform. I know we've mentioned this, and register. There's some data sets in there. There's one that we actually have down at the moment. We're doing a little maintenance on it. So you'll see some instructions for the Community Health Coalition, I think it's called in there, that probably won't actually be active today, but you'll see the Snow White one, which should feel familiar in terms of the actors in that network. And you can also create your own small network and kind of play with the tools as well. But we love sharing all of these kinds of little nuggets of network science. It's what makes our heart sing. So you can tell Jenny and I are both pretty excited about this work and talking about it. So please stay connected and let us know if you have other ideas for topics. We'd be happy to present more of these types of webinars for folks who are curious about different things, and reach out if you have any specific questions that we can help you with. And that said, we will end our webinar just right on time about, and thank you everyone for joining us and spending this hour with us. What we can see from your chat is you all are doing some pretty incredible work in community. So thank you for doing that work, and we hope that we can stay connected. Thank you.